I'm surrounded here by exceptional people, all experts in Alzheimer's disease. Roberta Brinton, who comes from University of Arizona, Paul Aisen, who leads the program at USC, and Allan Levey, who leads the program at Emory. So, as an ex-Alzheimer's researcher, I am stunned that since the cholinesterase inhibitors, which a lot of the people in my lab and me had a lot to do with in the late 70s, we haven't had a breakthrough drug since the late 70s. So what I want to start out by asking the panel is, what's taken us so long? Why are we here almost 40 years later and we still have cholinesterase inhibitors as our first-line treatment? Robbie.
So I think one of the reasons why we're still at it is Alzheimer's is complex. It is a disease of a long transition period that Allan will talk about in a moment. And that, quite frankly, just saying, 66% of all people with Alzheimer's disease are women. And some of us were in the trenches 30 years ago and are here to tell you it makes a difference.
Paul?
So Ken, this disease is difficult. That's why it's taken us a long time. For a long time, in fact, when you were working in the field, many people thought you'd never be able to treat this disease. You can't see it. You look at somebody who has Alzheimer's dementia, you can't tell on physical examination. You can't tell on CAT scan or MRI. Getting a handle on the nature of this disease has really been slow because it's been invisible. Yeah. And I think that while your work and others led us to treatments that are really helpful, when we try to move on to what we call disease-modifying treatments that did more than improve the symptoms, that actually get at the root cause, well, we didn't know enough about the disease then. And even as we learned more about the disease in the 80s, we still couldn't see it in people, and it's only been relatively recently, in the last 10 to 15 years, that we've been able to really look at this disease in living people.
So we'll come back to that because that's really important. Allan, your thoughts. Why has it taken so long?
Well, I think it's a new disease, ironically enough. So it was discovered a little over 100 years ago by Alzheimer. But what he really found is that it is occurring in people with a rare form, an aggressive form in your early onset. But I say it's a new disease because it wasn't until the 1970s that scientists and public became aware, and physicians, that this was actually the cause of senility, dementia. It wasn't a rare disease that was restricted to people in their 50s or 60s. This is the major cause. In fact, that led to the National Institutes of Health forming a whole institute, the National Institute of Aging, to start launching research into what's the cause of the disease. So the real research effort started only a little over 25 years ago, I would say, where we moved from the first era that Ken led to identify cholinesterase inhibitors to what are the causes of the things that Alzheimer himself saw under a microscope over 100 years ago. And those are the major changes that occur in the brain are amyloid plaques, neurofibrillary tangles, and we're still today now just having the tools of science to really understand what those things are made of and how we can think about tackling those in a rational way with new therapies.
Yeah, to underscore what Allan said, years ago, decades ago, when I was in medical school and we studied neurology, there was just a paragraph, I remember, in the neurology textbook on senile dementia. And it just talked about this as kind of some inevitability of aging. And Alzheimer's disease was like this rare condition of very early onset people. And we didn't realize until the work by Katzman and Terry that hey, the phenotype in the brain was all these plaques and tangles, and it was much more common. So we're here to talk about prevention. And one of the big breakthroughs that's going to help us with prevention, Paul alluded to. So Paul, maybe you can tell us more, and the panel can tell us more, about how we can identify Alzheimer's disease well before there are cognitive symptoms.
Well, I think if I were to mention what I think is the major breakthrough in the last 20 years, I would say it's the ability to image the plaques and tangles that Allan mentioned. So 15 years ago at the University of Pittsburgh, a method was discovered using PET scanning. So it's not CT scan, not MRI, but a PET scan that allowed you to see a molecular abnormality, the accumulation of plaques in the brain. Plaques are one of the two lesions, the two abnormalities in the Alzheimer's disease brain. There are plaques and tangles. And when we started being able to look at plaques in living people longitudinally, we were able to redraw the map, reformulate our understanding of this disease. And in fact, we discovered that the plaques accumulate decades before Alzheimer's disease dementia. And that has changed everything with regard to developing drugs. And now, in the last 5 years, a group has developed methods for seeing the tangles as well. And now we can image the two lesions, the two abnormalities in the brain in living people using amyloid PET and tau PET. Right. And that makes everything much more workable.
So suddenly, we're able to identify people who are at risk 15, 20 years before they have symptoms. So that provides a window for treatment. Now we can intervene way before people are symptomatic. So, Robbie and Allan, maybe you can tell us about what kind of interventions then become possible, and how does this change, we'll start with Allan, how does this change the way we conceptualize clinical trials?
Right. Well, I just want to add there are other ways other than PET and PET scanning to do this. We also do spinal taps. The problem that I see with PET imaging, when we move this to the public health domain or the rest of the world, we can't afford to do that. I know in my institution it costs sometimes up to $13,000 that a person would have to pay out of pocket for these scans. Right? Insurance won't cover it yet. So we definitely have to, if we're going to really prevent it, we have to think about it preventing this globally, and we really need other means other than PET, in my view, including a blood test or other ways.
But we're not that far from a blood test, right?
We're not, and I guess we can talk about that later, but to answer your question, what do we really need to do it is, following up Paul's comment that this disease, the disease pathology starts probably at least 20 years before symptoms begin. Currently, we've been recruiting people into clinical trials by waiting for them to come see a memory specialist or their primary care doctor with memory symptoms. If a family might notice memory loss, that's too late. It's 20 years after the disease has already been affecting the brain. So the real way for us to make progress, we all acknowledge now, is to start as early as possible. We can think about starting what's called secondary prevention, people who have no memory problems, their mind's working fine, but their brain is already showing the pathology. So that's secondary prevention. And then we also can begin to think about primary prevention. How do we even prevent the first pathology in the brain, even in the pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic stage?
Yeah. So what makes this so interesting is that there are possible ways to intervene that may not have to do with a pill or a drug. And Robbie has a lot of thoughts about that. So why don't you tell us what you're thinking now that we know we can maybe start 20 years earlier?
So what's interesting, what our research has shown is that the transition state that begins the process of Alzheimer's disease in women can actually begin not at menopause, but in those years prior to menopause, those 5 to 7 years of the perimenopause. And we can actually detect beta amyloid in the brains of women who are undergoing this transition. And who are those women? Those women are typically perimenopausal, they're ApoE4 positive, they have the risk factor.
People don't know what ApoE4 means. So tell us.
ApoE4 is a gene that codes for a cholesterol and lipid transporter. And it turns out that that's a risk factor. It's not absolute. So if you have the ApoE4 gene, that's good to know. It's not a determinant, it's a risk. And what's really exciting to the point of therapeutics is, wait a minute, what if we did that beta amyloid scan and found that this particular woman is developing beta amyloid in her brain and she's ApoE4 positive? Well, we can't change that she's chromosomally female. We can't change that she's ApoE4 positive, but we can change her metabolic health. And changing that metabolic health either through reintroducing estrogen, which regulates brain energy production, metabolism, as well as metabolism in the body, or other metabolic regulators, potentially metformin, we don't know that for sure, or one of Allan's favorites is exercise, right? So I'm not suggesting that exercise is going to be the panacea. What I am suggesting is that exercise actually puts you on the right path for preventing Alzheimer's disease. And if you're ApoE4 positive and you're female, you may want to consider regulators of cholesterol synthesis and or metabolic regulators or hormone therapy. But we're going to need something that was started at Mount Sinai in great, terrific enterprise there, is precision medicine. So Alzheimer's disease is a complex disease, as Paul said. And one size is not going to fit all for all time. There are multiple transitions, so we need to know where that person is in the process and treat them based on their sex biology, whether they're female or male, and on their ApoE4 biology, their risk biology, as well as other aspects. So, and what's really terrific about now is there's good news and encouraging news. And the good news is there's an army of very dedicated scientists and clinicians throughout the world that are working 24/7 on this problem. That's the good news. And the encouraging news is that we have a portfolio, we have a strategy, and we're going to bring those forward. For 30 years, we've been focused on beta amyloid. But in the meantime, there have been thousands of scientists working on other aspects of the disease, and they are coming forward now. So I'm really excited.
Good. And before we let Paul respond, see, there's a lot to say about beta amyloid. I want you to just come back to a point that you made in passing, which is, why do you think the frequency of Alzheimer's is twice in women than males? And tell us what that means to you.
So what was typically said about women and their twofold greater lifetime risk, again, 66% of people with Alzheimer's are women, is that people would say they just live longer. And that is true. They live on average 4.5 years longer than men. And that does not account for a 20-year disease process. And what our work has shown is that it's not because women live longer than men. It's because they start earlier. And they do start exactly about 20 years previous to the average age of diagnosis. And that you run into menopause and the perimenopause.
And you think that has a lot to do with glucose metabolism?
Yes.
And measures that people can look at, like fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C.
Thank you, Kat. I really appreciate the
No, I think it's
handoff.
important
Yeah.
because when we talk about prevention,
Yeah.
we don't have a pill yet.
Yeah.
But what we have are a lot of people in this room who are at the age that things are happening in their brain.
So what
And if your glucose levels may be fasting a little bit high, and if your hemoglobin A1C is what it might be a little bit high, it says you better start exercising and you better start watching your cardiovascular risk factors.
Yeah, and so fantastic, and obviously Ken has a great memory, which I'm pretty impressed by. And that is, essentially what we did is think about this. Even though there are going to be millions of people develop Alzheimer's disease, the reality is that 11% of people over the age of 65 are predicted to develop the disease. 89% are not. So we have 11% signal and 89% noise. How do we detect that 11% signal? And what Ken was referring to is that we can detect women at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease by using simple, clinically deployable indicators of metabolic health. Fasting glucose level, hemoglobin A1C, HDL, LDL, which I think everyone has heard about. And what distinguishes the women at risk is not that they're in the abnormal range, it's that they're on the wrong end of normal. So they're consistently high when an indicator is supposed to be low, they're consistently low when that indicator is supposed to be high. So we need to start having this ability to detect when that system is at its tipping point and move that system back through, I think, very standard clinical interventions that Ken already mentioned.
So, Paul, is it heterogeneous or homogeneous? Tell us what you think.
So we agree on a lot of things, and we disagree on a lot of things. I'd like to actually step back a second. I agree with many things that Allan and Robbie have been talking about, things that are good for the prevention of Alzheimer's disease. I don't think they are related to the specific mechanism of disease, though. I think what they do is improve the brain resilience. I think that if you exercise, it's good for brain health. It improves the environment in the brain, and it helps the brain resist insults like incipient Alzheimer's disease. Hormonal factors as well, whether it's the perimenopausal period in women or declining testosterone in men, these hormonal challenges have a deleterious effect on your brain's resilience. If you go out and learn 16 new languages after the age of 65, that's great. You're building a big network of brain connections that are new, and that is going to help you resist the disease. So I believe there are many things, many lifestyle changes, hormonal approaches, vascular interventions that help protect you against the symptoms of the disease, but are not getting at the disease itself. I believe that the disease starts with a specific biochemical event, and that ultimately the way we are going to eliminate the disease is with therapies that correct that specific biochemical event. What is it? Well, it's the generation of this amyloid that is the lesion.
Allan will get his turn. Go ahead.
It's a specific biochemical event in the brain that leads to this lesion, and ultimately, and we have it in sight, ultimately, we're going to monitor people in middle age for changes in the biochemistry. And then we're going to intervene with the Alzheimer's statin, let's call it. And that'll be a drug that you take by mouth that fixes this biochemical abnormality so that you never develop the specific disease. We're still going to recommend, Robbie, that we address the other issues, the hormonal challenges, promote exercise, promote healthy diet, promote social interactions, because that's good for your brain anyway. But the specific prevention of Alzheimer's disease is going to be around a biochemical event.
Allan,
you want
to referee here? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Let's take a step further back. So what do we think causes the disease? Because that gets to the root. I think Paul's suggesting that he knows the cause so that he's going to have a single drug that's going to reduce amyloid and prevent the disease from happening. And we all agree amyloid is an essential player in the disease. It's clearly playing a role. The real issue is when you think about a treatment, in my view, that may not be the right treatment. And there are lots of reasons for this. What we do know what causes the disease is that it's a complex disease. Again, we agree on that. Most studies suggest about 70 to 80% of the disease is inherited. So genetics plays a very strong role. Epidemiologic studies, environment, other things sort of fill in the gap for the other 20, 30%. And it's complex in lots of ways. We know, what we really know about the disease most comes from genetics right now, because we know that there are about 25 different genes which so far have been identified, which additively confer the risk for most people to get the disease. It's, in my view, what we've learned about those genes is that amyloid plays some role, but a lot of other things are going on, including metabolism, bioenergetics, the way proteins move from part to part in the brain. All sorts of different complex cellular mechanisms are basically getting enlightened by all these genetic risk factors. We're also learning some of the things that Paul talked about, resilience. I agree with the concept of resilience, but I think taking that a step further, it's really critical. If I'm 100 years old and I get Alzheimer's disease symptoms for the first time, I win. That's great. Shoot me then, I'm fine. I'll move to Oregon. But that resilience can prevent the disease for many people. That's the reality. So making a brain resilient, it has a huge, huge public health ability to prevent the disease. So I think that's really important. The other thing is that some of the lifestyle things that we're learning about, including even sleep. So the amount of sleep people get don't just make the brain resilient. Sleep seems to be playing an important role on clearing out some of the primary pathology, including Paul's favorite amyloid. So there are things that you might be able to modulate during a lifetime that could have a really dramatic impact on the disease.
So we're at a critical, pivotal moment here, in which, and we are in the field, in which we really have to make a decision about how much we invest in amyloid. I'm going to start with Allan and then let all the panelists respond to the following problem. There have been about 35 Alzheimer's drugs that have failed now. What does this say about what we've been doing, about the amyloid hypothesis? How has that happened?
It's one of my favorite questions. Thank you for that. One of the most interesting things that I have been involved in the last 5 years is an initiative from the NIH who asked that same question. And it was inspired by industry leaders, the same companies that have invested billions of dollars over the last 20 years that have funded those 35 failed trials. The industry leaders came together with the NIH and said, you know what? The way we do science has been flawed in this field. We're all doing the same thing in secret, and we have done the exact same thing. We've all focused on amyloid. We've found the exact same things independently rather than learning from each other and using our resources and our knowledge wisely. And they decided we're going to change the ecosystem of science by opening it up and having people work together, industry and academics, and share all the data and make it public. That initiative is called the Accelerating Medicines Partnership Program, and it's done for Alzheimer's disease, for diabetes, arthritis, something the National Institutes of Health is trying to change, and it's been the most exciting thing that I've been involved in. And what we're able to learn is get really smart people, because Ken's got a fantastic faculty member, Eric Schott at Mount Sinai. There are others around the country that are brilliant mathematicians who know how to put data together in an unbiased way, in a data-driven way, to help us learn from all the genetics, all the molecular phenotyping that we're able to do now on real postmortem human brains, including beginning to integrate the imaging that we can do in living people, so that we can say, what are the real scientific pieces of evidence telling us about the cause of the disease? And we're now at the transition point. We've already identified as a nation about 200 new targets for drugs to go after for Alzheimer's disease. So there's a tremendous opportunity to go about it, but we've got to think beyond amyloid.
Paul?
So I feel that it's necessary to point out that we actually all agree on many things. So
But
one of the things we agree on is that we need to test lots of ideas. That even those of us who think we understand one part of the disease, until we have an effective therapy, we need to test every plausible strategy. And I think I speak for everybody up here. Maybe this will be the only time.
Yeah, this is good.
That we really need to have an open mind and test many different strategies. So that means anti-amyloid drugs, anti-tau drugs, hormonal interventions, anti-inflammatory interventions, lifestyle-based interventions. These are all worthy of testing and are all being tested. So don't get the wrong impression that there are separate camps that are going in their own way. And as Allan said, critical to our success is a culture of sharing and collaboration within the field. And I think AMP-AED is a great example. It's not the only one. ADNI is another great example. We meet together, not just academics, as the people on the stage here are, but academics and pharmaceutical companies and small biotechs and regulators and patient advocates. We all meet together all the time and have discussions like this and disagree and agree and share and design the best studies that we can do and continue to work extremely hard with great collaborators to conduct as many studies as we can to get to effective therapy and primary prevention. So I think on that we all agree, right?
Yay.
Right. Now,
So-
why, to get to the question that you're asking, why do we have 35 negative studies? I think we have a lot to learn. We talked earlier about what I consider a real breakthrough is being able to visualize the disease. And we can visualize it with PET scans, seeing the tangles and the plaques. As Allan said, we can visualize a lot by sampling spinal fluid, which is much easier than perhaps it sounds. And we are getting close to being able to monitor all of the pathology of this disease with blood tests. That's coming very soon, so you won't have to spend $13,000 on scans. But this is giving us a wealth of information and a new ability to test ideas. So those 35 studies were done blind. I'm sorry, Robbie. 35 studies were done blind to what we're trying to treat. Now we can select the right people, and we can monitor the impact of our therapies on the disease itself because we can visualize it. We can go 20 years before symptoms, and we can see the disease developing, and we can intervene, and we have ways of measuring the impact of treatments. And this means that we're not going to have 35 more failures.
So can I just add one thing to that?
Please, and then I'm going to ask Robbie something. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
so I think you've hit on a really important point. The way we've had to do studies over the past 30 years is watching people's memory change. And there's a real problem with that because it changes very slowly and it changes variably. Sometimes people with Alzheimer's disease have it change rapidly over a few years, and other times it changes very slowly. And as we now move into an era where we're trying to go early and earlier, the studies are taking 6, 7 years sometimes before we'll actually have enough change in memory. So these biomarkers, the blood tests that Paul's talking about, the imaging, the spinal fluid, become really critical because we think we can shorten the timeline and really find the answers much sooner before we do some of these big things.
So, Robbie, how would you answer the question that if we had taken some of these 35 drugs and only given them to people before they had symptoms, when they had positive scans, the studies would have worked?
Okay, I'm going to go back a couple of steps, and let's stop and think about how we treated Alzheimer's disease. So we treated Alzheimer's disease at a point in time for that person. And Alzheimer's disease is a progressive disease. That means the disease is changing, right? And you know it changes because things are getting worse. And the idea has been that you start here and it's linear, right? What our work has shown is that it's not linear. It is a series of transitions, right? It's a series of transitions. So to get your point, it's a series of transitions that essentially what we see is that the brain is trying to stay alive and it's adapting. And then it runs through adaptation number 1 and drops to adaptation number 2 and drops to adaptation number 3. And so imagine, now we think that we can give a drug at this point and move everybody back to that point. When the fact is the biology has changed. And you know the biology has changed because the symptoms of the disease has changed. So imagine what we now have is a portfolio of therapeutics that move this person back up to stage from 3 to 2, to 2 to 1, from 1 to health, right? And so that's why we're going to need this broad portfolio of therapeutics that can treat the right person at the right time. We're developing something that was completely and totally unimaginable in the past, that the brain can actually regenerate itself, right? So these are the kinds of bold new ideas, the encouraging new ideas that are coming forth that have been in the pipeline for 20, 30 years. And we're here now. we're ready. We're ready to launch. And so we're very excited about the new frontier that exists now in Alzheimer's disease.
We're going to take questions soon, but I'm going to ask the panel, each of them, to address one other question. Years ago, there was a not very well done epidemiological study that talked about people who have anti-inflammatories in their medicine cabinet were less likely to get Alzheimer's disease than those who didn't, presumably saying that those people who are taking a lot of Advil and Aleve are somehow delaying the onset of Alzheimer's disease. There was some twin data that said that. And then there's a lot now of genetic data that suggests an inflammatory pathway. Can you each talk about inflammation and the role it may play in this disease and what it says about therapeutics, but briefly, and then we'll get to people's questions.
So let me start out first, because the first signal that we see coming online in the aging female brain and potentially in the male brain, let me just say that what we've learned from the female brain, some of it applies to the male brain, but what we learned were the right questions to ask from the female brain. And one of those questions comes back to the inflammatory piece, which is the first sign that we see that is coming online is actually inflammation. And it comes online early. It comes online as the first sign of a disease progression. And that is happening in the perimenopause.
Paul?
I agree that inflammation is important. In fact, I'm a rheumatologist by training, so the study of inflammation has always been part of my life. And actually, I entered this field when Ken recruited me as a rheumatologist to help target inflammation in AD back in the 1980s.
Just to say, rheumatoid arthritis primarily affects women, just saying.
Okay.
Just saying.
We followed up on epidemiologic studies that pointed to nonsteroidals like Advil, and our results were quite discouraging, but we kept thinking about anti-inflammatory drugs and tested several others that also had disappointing results. I think now what we're doing is we're taking a much more specific look at inflammatory mechanisms, particularly, I would say, microglial activity in the brain that is pointed to by specific genes that influence the expression of AD. And we now think that microglia play these cells in the brain, inflammatory cells in the brain, play a big role in managing changes, whether it's amyloid or tau or other things. And we need to now develop specific therapies that encourage the beneficial activity of these inflammatory cells while tamping down the adverse effects of brain inflammation that we think actually contribute to symptoms. So it's a hard nut to crack, but very important.
Allan?
So I completely agree. We've profiled over 2,000 human brains now, understanding the genetics and all the gene expression and the protein changes. And we see over 400 proteins that are part of the inflammation network, which are activated in these pre-symptomatic stages, just complementing what Robbie said. Several other groups are seeing this, and we're seeing it in brains from across the country. Robbie, we're seeing it in men too.
Yeah,
So,
well,
right?
I'm not.
So, oh, well.
Yeah.
So
They do share some.
let's take some questions. Go ahead. Let's stand up. We need a mic so we can everybody be patient so we can hear what you have to say.
Thank you. I thought I heard everybody say that one of the ways we're going to stave off the disease is by developing new connections in the brain. I think there's some pretty good evidence about the olfactory sense, being able to do that. And I was wondering if the panel could comment about current research or what your thoughts are about utilizing the olfactory sense to help this disease.
That's a very, very interesting point, because the olfactory neurons are one of the sets of cells in the brain that regenerate throughout life, right? And so one of the key elements, the question is can a loss in the ability to regenerate those olfactory cells actually tell us something about what's happening in the regenerative capacity in the brain, right? So I think it's a great question. There is an association between loss of olfaction and risk of Alzheimer's disease. It's not well studied, but I think it's an area for future study.
Maybe we can talk a little more about the connectivity and the point that Paul was alluding to about learning languages, because there's some data around people who are bilingual and their risk for Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, I mean, I think the brain is a large collection, a very large collection of brain cells, of neurons, and there are many, many of these connections, and brain function requires all these connections, and having a very rich network makes you resilient. When you start to lose that network, there are various manifestations, one of which might be a sensory failure, and olfaction, smell, seems to be particularly notable as an indicator of early neurodegenerative disease. Not only Alzheimer's, but Parkinson's very much so as well. And I think, yes, it points to connections, to the network, to the synapses in the brain that need to be protected, to protect everything, since everything in the brain ultimately is at risk in a disease like Alzheimer's. It starts with memory, but it spreads and affects everything. And learning about both lifestyle changes and hormonal changes and potentially medications that build connections and protect against loss of neuronal connections are going to help. They're going to help in all neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's.
One of the most exciting things we've learned about brain science and the things that make these connections, it's actually the same microglia that regulate inflammation that Paul was talking about, that we're all talking about, we think is a really important contributor to Alzheimer's disease. And what happens is these same microglia, when they get activated, they can tear apart the synapses, these connections. So as we learn about this, those are the ways that we're going to regenerate connections as well.
Yes. We go to
I'd just like to clarify this idea that anti-tau, anti-amyloid initiatives have failed. In my view, they haven't failed yet. Animal data shows they clear the amyloid. Animal data shows that sometimes they clear the amyloid with attendant brain damage while trying to remove these toxic components from the neurons. Trials in humans have shown very good improvement in the amount of amyloid in the brain, but there have been side effects. So to say that anti-amyloid has failed, I think is disingenuous. I'd say the same thing about inflammation, right? Tried the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, tried prednisone, didn't work, abandon it? No. Inflammation is part of almost every neurological disease, and it's an epiphenomenon, or it's a way that the body tries to scavenge things that are toxic in the nervous system. So these are still very vital approaches. None of them should be discounted. But it troubles me to say, 45 trials of anti-amyloid have failed when they're getting so close to something that's actually effective and not so toxic.
Paul thanks you for that comment.
If it was a plan.
I'm going to be too polite to respond to that.
Hi. Dr. Allison Ballbag at the University of Southern California did a wonderful study about the effect of music, and that 64% less dementia, Alzheimer's, is found in musicians. So I'd like for you all to address a little bit of that, if you would, please.
Well, let me start, and then others will talk about this. Thanks to Laurie Tisch and the Illumination Foundation, we're actually studying music at Mount Sinai. One of the things that I found remarkable and has encouraged us to look at music is that even at the end stage of Alzheimer's, where people have lost their ability to speak, have lost their language, they can suddenly speak again the songs.
Yeah.
And, they can't verbalize, but yet the capacity to verbalize is there, and it comes out in another brain connection, and they start to sing an old song. So there's a lot to be learned from music. And whether those musicians are like people who have another language and they have more connections and that protects them and gives them some resilience, I don't know. I'd like to hear what the rest of the panel thinks about that.
So one of the interesting things is that when you think about music, right, it's a sensory experience. And it's a sensory experience that activates not only the right hemisphere, but the entire brain, right? So, and it is also very interesting that there is a difference between how the two hemispheres are affected by Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease preferentially begins to affect the left hemisphere, right? And then the right hemisphere. So that's one part. The other is, I would agree with Ken's statement that it may well be this aspect of language. And I think it's a fantastic area to study.
Anybody, Allan, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's just something that's really out of the box. It's just emerging. Is some investigators have found recently that if you flicker the lights at a certain frequency, or you play sounds like music at a certain frequency, it has to be 40 hertz for 40 times per second that the lights flash, or a certain frequency of the sounds. The brain neurons change their rhythm into that activity. And it actually seems to activate these resilient mechanisms and actually can clear out amyloid in animal models. So it's really cool. So things like music might actually be changing brain physiology.
Yeah, so over here, go ahead.
So is there any truth to the fact that the brain develops the amyloid plaques as a response to toxins piercing the blood-brain barrier? And some of these drugs have eliminated them altogether, which has then accelerated the disease because some small amount is necessary
Well, you want to take
for
that?
protection?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot we don't understand, and there certainly is credible scientific work that points to beneficial effects of forms of amyloid. We know that certain forms of amyloid, diffusible oligomeric forms would be a technical term, but some forms are highly toxic. But other forms seem to play some protective role under certain circumstances. Does that mean that the amyloid accumulation is actually a protective mechanism against an infection, for example, like a virus crossing into the brain? There are credible scientists who have proposed this. I don't think the evidence is convincing yet, but we certainly have learned that sometimes when we hit amyloid too hard with drugs, trying to get rid of it, we see adverse effects that might be consistent with knocking down some of the beneficial effects of forms of amyloid. What I'm trying to say is that we have a lot to learn yet. We have to be open to these ideas and continue to explore the impact of many different types of interventions.
Way in the back.
I was just wondering if you could speak to the interest in ketogenic diet as a treatment for these diseases.
So there is, I think, the potential for ketone bodies to be.
For those who don't know, tell us what you're talking about.
So
ketogenic
ketone bodies
and what is a ketogenic diet and ketone bodies?
Yeah, so a ketogenic diet increases the ketones in blood, for example, and ketones can be used as a fuel for generating energy ATP in the brain, right? So where I think this is a very promising area because what we see is that the brain is trying to generate those ketone bodies. And that may actually lead to some deleterious effects in the brain. But we're still in early stages. And this is, again, where I think it's critical that we look at Alzheimer's not as a magic bullet kind of disease, but one of complexity. So the idea is that ketone bodies would be beneficial, but that also requires that you can get ketone bodies into the brain and that you can metabolize those ketone bodies, that the entire system is working. And I don't think that is the case. However, I think nutritional interventions are going to be absolutely necessary. The brain has to recover from this disease, and the brain is dependent on nutrients to generate energy and to generate, all the cells that are necessary. So I think this is an untapped area, really, in the field of nutritional intervention.
I can add a little bit. So when I was a trainee at Johns Hopkins in neurology, one of my professors invented the ketogenic diet, basically. And what it is feeding large amounts of butter and fat. And I mean, it's a really hard diet to have. It's totally unpalatable. But it was developed for kids with epilepsy. right? And so whether the ketones get into the brain or not, I mean, these were kids that basically had a life that they didn't have a life. They were bedbound because their seizures were so frequent, and some seizures just were completely eliminated. So, I mean, there can be dramatic effects on brain function, and that's well established now.
Okay. In the back on this, yes, go ahead. No, yes.
Exercise is almost universally recommended. Would you comment a bit on the mechanism, how exercise may be helpful, and
Allan, you wanna-
on the published evidence that in fact it is helpful?
Yeah, well, there have been several studies of exercise and many more to go. I mean, it's a really exciting area. And at least my sense is it's probably what we would call pleiotropic. There are probably many different ways that exercise could be beneficial. I think I completely agree with Paul. It might be a very general way to make the brain more resilient. We're learning the blood vessels play an important role in not only Alzheimer's disease, but a variety of these brain diseases. Exercise seems to make the blood vessels healthier. It lowers cholesterol typically and changes our cholesterol metabolism in ways that are healthy as well. There's also very interesting research that shows that when people exercise, there may be some factors released into the blood which get into the brain, which cause new brain cells to be born, so called neurotrophins. So, and I'm sure there are other ways as well. And so I think there's a lot to learn, but already it's clear that there are lots of positive things, with the only downside being people get, aching knees and need to see a rheumatologist.
Okay, we have time for, go ahead. Yes. Nope, you're right there, yes.
First of all, the presentation was fascinating. Not terribly optimistic, but fascinating. As a 73-year-old clinical psychologist whose mother had this disease for 11 years, I'm not so sure from a psychological perspective. I want to know that I have a 48% chance of getting this disease in the next 15 years. So speak to the issue of should you really work up somebody to that point when we don't have the panacea, or how you manage the psychological piece of this disorder.
Right. So essentially you're asking, since we have a way of detecting these plaques before you get symptoms, do you want to know?
I don't.
Okay. And you and I have talked about this, and I've got a mother and a grandmother also who had Alzheimer's, and I don't want to know. But go ahead. What do you want?
So I would.
But I lead my life as if it's going to happen, and I do everything I can to prevent it.
Yeah. So and I would emphasize that, right? So for late onset Alzheimer's disease, yes, there are genetic risk factors. So having a mother with Alzheimer's disease is a risk. Having a father with Alzheimer's disease is not a risk. Well, why is that? Well, we inherit our mitochondrial DNA only from our mothers. Well, what that tells you is that, wait a minute, I need to work on generating energy. And how do I do that? Exercise is one of those ways. Exercise and regulating diet and sustaining cognitive activity are all ways to enable the brain to help to survive. And the part about exercise in the vasculature is the highway of nutrients to the brain. Keeping that vasculature open and freely moving is critical. So I think for late onset Alzheimer's disease, it is very encouraging. We'd have sufficient evidence to suggest what we actually should be doing. Do we have evidence that says absolutely A, B, and C, or for another person, C, D, and E, right? We're not there yet, but I think I would be very encouraged.
Well, on
Can
that
I-
note, go ahead, and then we'll
I'm sorry,
have to be an encouraging note.
It is.
Go ahead.
So I was going to actually question your premise. I am very optimistic, even having lived through the last 30 years of disappointments. I am very optimistic. We understand this disease to a level of clarity that is a complete game changer. And the trials that we're doing now are based on this new knowledge that's vastly increasing our likelihood of success, coupled with the fact that NIH funding for this disease has quadrupled in the last few years. when you couple that with the kind of vigorous exchanges that we all have, working together to vet ideas and coming up with the best ideas and the best specific trial designs, I think we're going to see success soon. I think that we're going to have effective therapies in the coming years, 5 years, and I think we're going to get to prevention of Alzheimer's disease in the next couple of decades. I'm very optimistic. But you probably have children and grandchildren. And I would not recommend testing for amyloid unless you're willing to participate in a clinical trial.
Right.
And we have lots of clinical trials. What slows us down is not enough volunteers. And so I hope more people just want to volunteer to have tests and then join clinical trials. And that'll mean that it won't take us 20 years.
All right, thank you all for coming. I thank the panelists. Great job.